Portions of Aviation Highlights were made possible by a donation from Dynamic Recording Studio and by Rillo Associates, a full-service advertising and public relations agency. Hi, I'm Pakusch. This is the September edition of Aviation Highlights, a monthly TV program about aviation in and around the Rochester area. Aviation Highlights comes to you monthly on cable channel 12. For the month of September, we're coming to you from the National Warplane Museum at Geneseo, where the 1989 Rings of Eagles Air Show is in progress. During quieter times, the Geneseo Airport's grass-strip runways remind many World War II pilots of the old English countryside in the early 1940s. It was from those runways that the Allied Air Forces launched their aerial attacks against Nazi and Nazi-occupied territories. These are some of the airplanes that helped to win freedom from the Axis armies all over the world. These airplanes were on display on the ground and in the air at the 1989 Rings of Eagles Air Show. The National Warplane Museum in Geneseo is dedicated to aviation preservation and education. Bill Lau is a member of the museum and one of the air show's announcers.
We have 3,000 plus members right now. Many of them volunteer here at the museum. And the museum has exactly 5 paid staff members, most of whom work in the office. It's a very, very unique organization in that regard, and it's one of the things that I enjoy about it, quite frankly, is that the volunteer support is what makes the place work. It's people who love what they're doing.
Aviation Highlights covered the air show on Friday, August 18th, when many aircraft from out of town arrived, and on Saturday, August 19th. The air show continued on Sunday the 20th, when the highlight was the heavy bomber extravaganza, a formation flight of 5 B-17 Flying Fortresses and an Avro Lancaster. The Saturday performance came to an abrupt end because of heavy rains. On Saturday morning, the Rings of Eagles 1989 air show began with a reenactment of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
I see we have our P-40 driver running out of the museum and getting the airplane. Put it down, Bill.
The planes used here are replicas of Japanese aircraft and were built for use in the movie Tora, Tora, Tora. 2 were also used in the miniseries War and Remembrance. Dr. Bill Anderson flies the Curtiss P-40E Warhawk.
Well, Paul, I'm on the Board of Trustees and I'm on the Executive Committee, and I'm also chairman of long-range planning.
What do you think it is about the museum that attracts most people to be so heavily involved?
There are a number of things, I think. I think the first thing that's most attractive to most people is the airplanes themselves. They're magnificent machines. During World War II, this country built 300,000 warplanes. And today, we have cases, for instance, in the case of the P-40s, 14,000 made and just 10 are still flying in the whole country. The B-17s, 13,000 were made. Granted, 5,000 were lost in combat, but today in this country only about 9 of those still fly, and in fact in the whole world about only 50 are known to exist. So it is the machines themselves and the need to preserve them. For me personally, it's a sense of history. The aircraft played a very vital part in this country being what it is today, and I think we learned from them about that history, and we also, in seeing them, I think, remember what went on during that time. A lot of people died. There was a lot of anger in the world, and the airplanes serve as a reminder of that time so that we should not do it again. Someone made that famous quote, "We are doomed to repeat our history if we forget it." And we don't want people to forget it. And that really, I think, is the attraction for me.
One of the highlights of the 1989 Wings of Eagles Air Show was the appearance of the Canadian Warplane Heritage's Avro Lancaster. It is one of only 2 such aircraft flying in the world. Gil Hunt describes the airplane.
This is a Lancaster Mark 10 with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines built by Packard in Detroit, and they put out 1640 horsepower each. This particular airplane, there were 15 more made after this one in Malton, Ontario, built by Victory Aircraft for a total of 430. There are, of course, well over 7,000 built in total in the UK. This particular airplane was built in July 1945, so it never saw any action during the war. However, it flew with the Royal Canadian Air Force from 1945 to 1963 and completed well over 4,000 hours of flying time. When it was decommissioned in 1963, it was purchased by the Canadian Legion at Goderich, Ontario. It was flown to Goderich and sat on a pedestal there from that period to 1975. In 1975, it had deteriorated, and the Legion were no longer able to keep it up the way they felt it should be, and so they wanted to sell it to us. We couldn't raise the money in Canadian Warplane Heritage because we're a non-profit organization, and we were in our infancy anyway, and really didn't know what to do with an airplane of this size. Anyway, a foundation called the Sully Foundation purchased the airplane for $10,000 and then donated it to Canadian Warplane Heritage. It then took us 2 years to get it moved from Goderich, which is about 150 miles from our base in Hamilton, Ontario. We had to take the wings off, take the engines off, and so on. Ended up by talking the Air Force into coming down with a large helicopter and lifting the fuselage and bringing it to Hamilton. So in 1979, we started a restoration. Because we knew it was going to be a civil registered airplane, we had to involve our Ministry of Transport. They insisted that we pull the airplane down to nuts and bolts, x-ray it, and go through quite a lot of extensive inspection. So the airplane was pulled down to nuts and bolts and bits and pieces, and then we started to rebuild it. I think the main or big thing about the airplane, it has been completely restored by volunteers, ranging in age from 15 to 79. About 100 total worked on the airplane, but about 25 at any one time. So as far as we can ascertain, this is the largest restoration ever undertaken by groups of volunteers. Then last year, as a matter of fact, the 11th of September last year, we flew the airplane for the first time. Again, because of the Ministry of Transport assistance, we had to bring the only man that was current on Lancasters over from England, who was flying the only other one that's flying in the world, owned by the Royal Air Force. He came over, and we did 2 test flights. And they had to be test flights as if it was a brand new airplane. Then we flew it again publicly on the 24th of September. We had expected something like 5,000 people to the Hamilton Airport to see it fly, and we ended up with well over 20,000, with another 20,000 trying to get into the airplane. But we think that the airplane is capable of flying for the next 40 years, providing it's maintained in the way it should be, and money can be raised to keep it flying. Now the airplane VRA is, of course, known as the Menoskey Memorial Lancaster, named after Pilot Officer Menoskey, B.C., the only Canadian in Bomber Command to win the Victoria Cross in World War II, and he was a mid-upper gunner. The airplane that it represents had exactly 44 hours and 20 minutes on it total time when it was shot down, June 13th, 1944. We try to keep it as presentable as we can so that the public can see it in its best image. We're very proud of this airplane and very proud to show it.
The National Warplane Museum at Geneseo is especially noted for its possession of a B-17 Flying Fortress fuddy-duddy. Bill Lau talks about it.
It was 1985, as a matter of fact. The B-17, which we own, was a plane that was built by Douglas back in 1945. I'll give you a little history of the aircraft. It was built in 1945, which was toward the end of the war, so it never actually saw combat. In fact, the aircraft that are now flying of the B-17s, none of them were ever actually in combat in this country anyway. And what happened was it was sent to a depot in the Pacific, sat out the rest of the war, and then was converted into a VIP transport. Among others, General MacArthur and General Eisenhower used this aircraft as a transport when it was in the military service. From there, it went to a company called Globair in Mesa, Arizona, and for better than 20 years was used by Globair as a fire bomber. Now this, of course, meant that it was stripped still further of its military gear. So the airplane was basically right down to bare bones when they were using it, and right before we got it, it was assigned the ultimate fate of most aircraft that get old and were military aircraft at one time. It was a crop sprayer, a bug sprayer. It had booms mounted under the wings, and it would fly over and spray bugs. When we got it, it smelled of malathion inside, something terrible. We've only just finally started getting rid of that odor in the aircraft. In 1985, Globair had 4 of these. They were, I believe, the last 4 that were in commercial operation in this country, and they discovered that they were getting very expensive to operate. So they decided to sell them at auction down in Mesa, Arizona, and we heard about it. We checked out this particular airplane. When I say we, others from the museum, and they went down and bid on it. They purchased it for $250,000 and brought it back here, flew it back here. And since that time, we have been trying to restore the airplane to its original glory, which has meant, putting turrets back on it, putting guns in it, changing the nose glass, repainting it. The aircraft is painted as one that, another airplane that flew with the 447th Bomb Group out of Rattlesnake, England during the war in 1943. And it was named Fuddy Duddy. And the reason that we selected that name was because this aircraft had the distinction of flying 96 missions without an abort. In other words, 96 times able to go out and drop the bombs and come back without having to turn back. On its 97th mission, though, the original Fuddy Duddy collided with another B-17 over Mannheim and was lost, along with all but 2 of the members of that crew. There are, however, about 16 members surviving from the first 3 crews. And in 1987, when we dedicated the aircraft in the Fuddy Duddy, we had them in here, and they had a glorious weekend with the airplane. I might also mention that Dominic Zapparo is one of the original crew members from Fuddy Duddy. He happens to be a member of our museum, lives right down in Leicester, right close to the museum. And that also is partly how we came to choose the name Fuddy Duddy for our aircraft.
Owen Hughes is the man who painted the nose art on Fuddy Duddy.
Well, I guess I'm considered the official artist and sign painter here. I did the Fuddy Duddy just recently. And this is what I used to do during the war. I was painting the pinup girls on the B-17s and B-24s and patches on the pilots' jackets, and all the artwork that was required. It was not really my job because they didn't have a job for an artist, but since I did this work, this is all they gave me to do. Morale booster thing.
Another B-17G present at this air show was the Texas Raiders. William Cyrus talks about it.
It was originally manufactured May the 9th of 1944, and it never got to the war and everything. It stayed around the United States and everything, and it wound up with the people that filmed the maps and everything. And they took it and they flew it, and then the plane went to South America and come back. The Confederate Air Force purchased this plane, we understand, for around $250,000 back in 1977. And when we got it, it had nothing on it. It had no guns, it had no turrets, it had nothing on it. And along about 1984, I believe it was, around 83 or 84, if memory serves me right, we took on a project that nobody else has ever took up. We decided to tear this plane down and completely rebuild it. And we took it all apart and everything like that. We found corrosion in it and everything else. But when we went back together, we found some people that had some real machine gun barrels and everything. This plane is complete with the machine guns except for the firing mechanism. So we decided to restore it to a complete configuration, which took over 2.5 years. Around June 19th of 1986, we had our first flight on it. And I was standing at a Hobby Airport, and I said to myself, I said, this plane, I said, I'm just pleased to see it roll out of here. And he flew for about 20 minutes. And I went and I done a sigh of relief, and I was real proud of it. Ever since then, she's been on tour all over the United States and everything. This is 2 of our planes right here, Texas Raiders and Sentimental Journey. But the Confederate Air Force has about 147 of them, and roughly 79 of them are flying because the rest of them are under restoration right now. They're very hard to come by. Well, the Confederate Air Force is an organization, it's a non-profit organization. We restore planes from 39 to 45, not to provoke war, but to bring a flying museum to you fine people. The crew that flies this, we travel our own expenses and everything. All we do is get the pleasure of watching people smile at us and talk about the airplanes and everything.
You have to preserve your defense capability with the most modern equipment you can. And quite frankly, the airplanes aren't needed anymore. Not many people know it, but when you see World War II aircraft flying, or any vintage aircraft flying, military, they are flown by individuals or by museums. The federal government does not support them in any way. And quite frankly, I don't think the taxpayers would approve of that. Even the Air Force Museum in Dayton is actually run by a foundation that is separate from the Air Force. So it's just a question of, what do you want to spend your tax dollars on? Do you want to spend your tax dollars preserving airplanes? I don't think most people would. It's sad, but true. I don't think the government can necessarily be faulted for it. I think, if anything, we as people should be faulted for it because, again, it's preserving our history. And when you're close to something, say at the end of World War II, you really don't necessarily want to preserve that because it's not been the most pleasant time you've ever had. It's just as lief forget it. And sad but true, we are faced with that situation with these airplanes. Only in fairly recent years has there been a move now to preserve them, especially in flying condition. That's another thing that's unique about our museum, I think, is that we preserve them with the goal of flying. A lot of people say, oh my gosh, you shouldn't fly them because they're priceless relics. If you break them, they're irreplaceable. I don't think people can really appreciate a vintage aircraft unless they see it in its element, which is, of course, the sky. On the ground, they're lovely to look at, but they were meant to fly, and not to fly them, to us at least, seems almost a crime.
In addition to bombers and fighters, another type of airplane important for the air effort was the transport plane. These planes were usually unarmed and carried troops, casualties, and supplies. Todd Hackbarth talks about the C-47 Yankee Doodle Dandy.
This airplane is a Douglas DC-3. The military version is the C-47. The C stood for cargo. This was the airplane that carried the paratroopers in World War II and towed the gliders in World War II.
Can you tell me some of the history about this specific plane?
Okay, this airplane here was not delivered until April of 1945, so it was a late model airplane. It was used as a navigational trainer. Instead of using it as a cargo airplane, they used it as a flying classroom to teach navigators their trade, how to navigate. And it stayed in the service from 45 till 1965, when it was loaned to the University of Michigan, who used it for classified military research, infrared research. They cut the belly out of the airplane, put plexiglass panels in it, and used it as an infrared camera platform. Our museum acquired it in 1982 and it took us 20 months to get it restored, basically to military configuration and the paint scheme that it flew in the military after World War II. And now we fly it to air shows and events all across the Midwest.
This B-24 did not land at the Geneseo airport, but it flew in for a formation flight with the B-17 and the Avro Lancaster. Evans is a member of the National Warplane Museum who flew in both World War II and Korea.
Well, I've been elected by the board of directors as the ambassador of the museum, primarily because of my experience in the Air Force, 12 years in the Air Force, combat tour in the Pacific, World War II and Korea. World War II, I flew 42 active combat missions with the 13th Air Force in a B-25. Then I transferred to 13th Air Force headquarters as a combat-trained pilot to take the staff out of missions, which we didn't get credit for. I think I got another 40 of those. But in doing this, I had 600, almost 600 combat hours in 42 missions, something like 1,800 hours in B-25.
The Rude Invader is an A-26, a twin-engine bomber. Bill Bielauskas talks about this airplane.
The Rude Invader is a Douglas A-26 Invader, a medium bomber from World War II. It's powered by two Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines, and it was used late in World War II, and it took over the B-26 Marauder's place, which was another medium bomber. This was used in the military all the way into Vietnam, became a B-26, and I used this quite usefully in Vietnam, which I saw it. And this particular craft here, after its military service, it was used as a Boer bomber in the Midwest, as far as I know. And it was bought by the organization in Indiana, and it was just recently purchased by Rayburn.
A lot of people complain that we're, waving a flag or we're trying to reconstitute war or something like this. It's not the reason. The reason we have this place here is to remember the people that were in it in World War II and Korea, and that's exactly why we have it, why we have all the memorabilia, and why we have the airplanes here. Flying them is a lot of fun. Flying them requires a lot of work, but I think they should be flown. I really do. As long as we can. We may not. If we get an air group as big as the Airplane Museum at Dayton has, there's no way we could get enough pilots to fly them to start with. But keep the lead ones going, like the B-17 and this big fellow here who is famous one way or another, and the P-40 and things like that. I think it's fun. I think we should do it. And I don't, somebody criticizes what we're doing. I think they're doing it unjustly. That's our problem, not theirs. If we can afford to do it and get the people to do it, I think we should keep on going. Well, just come and see a big air show, see what happens. We had 85,000 people last year. Somebody thought we were doing something right. And we hope to keep on doing that. We've got a lot of cooperation from all kinds of people all over the country that have warbirds. They want to come in and they want to be part of the show. And I think we should let them come.
The National Warplane Museum also has a PBY Catalina in its collection. This amphibious airplane is very well remembered for rescuing thousands of downed airmen from oceans and beaches in all theaters of the war. The National Warplane Museum's PBY was built in 1945. It was acquired in Florida, where it was used as a trainer or maritime patrol plane. Over 2 years of volunteer work have gone into the effort to restore it to operating condition. This summer it flew for the first time in the Wings of Eagles Air Show. Watch closely now, here comes the watermelon drop.
I think a better example of the kind of volunteer help that we get is the fact that we had an air show to go to with the B-17 in Canada. We were supposed to leave on a Friday, and on a Thursday evening, the B-17 blew an engine. And it took a volunteer crew. It takes a large crew to change one of those engines. They're quite tall, quite heavy. It took from about 6 o'clock in the evening till about 2 o'clock in the morning, and they pulled the engine off the airplane. And another crew came on and stripped all the accessories off of it and put them on another engine and had that engine back on the airplane by 11 o'clock Friday night. And at 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, the airplane was ready to go. Now, this entailed some people not being paid a cent, working 20 hours at a stretch. That's the kind of volunteers we have.
It began to rain off and on Saturday, August 19th. The air show went on for a while. Finally, the rain became too heavy, and the air show had to come to a stop. If you would like information about joining the National Warplane Museum, you can call them at 243-0690. That's 243-0690 for the National Warplane Museum. We hope you're enjoying this presentation of Aviation Highlights. It's a monthly TV program about aviation in and around the Rochester area. I'm Paul Pakusch. Each episode plays at least twice on cable channel 12 in the city of Rochester and in a number of the suburban towns. Here is a list of when you will be able to watch next month's episode of Aviation Highlights in this viewing area. That's it for the September edition of Aviation Highlights. I'm Paul Pakusch at the National Warplane Museum in Geneseo. Join us again in October for another edition of Aviation Highlights. Portions of Aviation Highlights were made possible by a donation from Dynamic Recording Studio and by Rillo Associates, a full-service advertising and public relations agency.